Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. You guys have been absolutely relentless with these requests. I'm talking months of comments, DMs, emails, all asking for the same thing. Amazon delivery driver horror stories. And let me tell you, finding 3 genuinely terrifying stories from drivers who were willing to share their experiences, that took some serious digging. But I finally found them. 3 stories that will make you think twice about those late-night deliveries and remote drop-offs. These aren't your typical difficult customer complaints or got lost in the woods mishaps. No, these are the kind of encounters that stick with you long after your shift ends. The kind that make you question whether that next delivery is worth the risk. Before we dive in, I need you to understand something. Amazon delivery drivers see everything. They go to every corner of every neighborhood, from the pristine suburban streets to the most isolated rural properties. They're out there in all weather, at all hours, often alone and vulnerable. And sometimes they encounter things that go way beyond a simple package delivery. The first story comes from Marcus, a driver who worked the evening shift in rural Oregon for 2 years before he finally quit. He reached out to me through Reddit after seeing one of my previous videos, and what he told me genuinely gave me chills. Marcus was always one of those drivers who took pride in completing every delivery, no matter how challenging the location or how late it got. That dedication almost cost him his life. It was a Thursday evening in November, around 7:30, when Marcus pulled up to what should have been a routine delivery. The address led him down a winding dirt road about 15 minutes off the main highway, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. The kind of place where your GPS signal starts cutting out, and you begin to wonder if you took a wrong turn somewhere. The house itself looked normal enough from the outside. A modest 2-story home with peeling paint and a front porch that had seen better days. There was a single light on in what appeared to be the living room window, and an old pickup truck parked in the gravel driveway. Nothing that would immediately raise any red flags. Marcus grabbed the package from the back of his van. It was a medium-sized box, nothing unusual about it, and walked up to the front door. The porch creaked under his weight, and he noticed the doorbell didn't seem to be working when he pressed it. So he knocked instead. 3 solid knocks that echoed through what sounded like an empty house. That's when things started feeling off. He could hear movement inside, but it wasn't the normal sounds of someone coming to answer the door. It was more like furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by what sounded like hushed, urgent whispering. Multiple voices, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. Marcus waited for about 30 seconds, then knocked again. This time, the sounds inside stopped completely. Dead silence. He called out, "Amazon delivery," but got no response. Now Marcus had been doing this job long enough to know that some people just don't want to answer the door, especially in rural areas where folks value their privacy. So he decided to just leave the package on the porch and take the required photo for proof of delivery. But as he was setting the box down, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. There were dark stains on the wooden boards of the porch. Stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. And they were recent enough that they hadn't been completely washed away by the rain they'd had a few days earlier. Marcus immediately stood back up, package still in his hands, and that's when he heard it. A sound that he says still haunts him to this day. It was a muffled scream, definitely human, coming from somewhere inside the house. Not a scream of surprise or anger, but the kind of desperate, terrified scream that makes every instinct in your body tell you to run. He started backing away from the door, his heart pounding, when the front door suddenly creaked open just a few inches. Not wide enough to see who was behind it, but enough for a voice to slip through. A man's voice, low and gravelly, said, "Just leave it there and go." But here's the thing that really freaked Marcus out. While this man was talking to him, he could still hear that muffled screaming from somewhere deeper in the house. And now he could tell it was a woman's voice, and she was calling for help. Marcus didn't hesitate. He dropped the package right there on the porch and sprinted back to his van. As he was fumbling with his keys trying to get the engine started, he saw the front door open wider. A tall, heavy-set man in a flannel shirt stepped onto the porch, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, Marcus could make out at least two other figures in the shadows of the doorway. The man on the porch just stood there, watching as Marcus finally got his van started and began backing down the driveway. But what Marcus remembers most clearly is the man's expression, or rather, the complete lack of one. No anger, no concern about the dropped package, no explanation for the screaming. Just a blank, emotionless stare as Marcus drove away. The moment he got back to an area with cell service, Marcus called the police. He gave them the address, described what he'd heard and seen, and told them about the bloodstains on the porch. The dispatcher took all his information and assured him they'd send someone to check it out. 3 hours later, Marcus got a call back from the sheriff's department. They'd been to the house, they said, but no one was home. No vehicles in the driveway, no lights on, and no answer at the door. They'd walked around the property and hadn't seen anything suspicious. As for the bloodstains Marcus mentioned, the officer said he hadn't noticed any, but it was dark and they'd only used flashlights. Marcus was frustrated, but figured maybe whoever lived there had left after his visit, possibly to avoid any police contact. He filed his report with Amazon about the failed delivery and thought that would be the end of it. But 2 weeks later, he was assigned another delivery to the same address. This time he wasn't taking any chances. He drove to the location during daylight hours, around 2 in the afternoon, and brought a coworker with him. When they pulled up to the house, everything looked different. The front porch had been power washed clean, the old pickup truck was gone, and there were new curtains in the windows. It looked like someone had been doing some serious cleaning and renovating. Marcus knocked on the door, and this time it was answered by a middle-aged woman who seemed completely normal. She was friendly, thanked him for the delivery, and even apologized for not being home the previous time he'd tried to deliver. When Marcus carefully asked if everything was okay, she looked confused and said everything was fine. But as they were walking back to their van, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was fresh concrete poured in a rectangular patch in the backyard, right behind the house. It was roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and the concrete was still light gray, indicating it had been poured very recently. Marcus never reported that second visit to the police. He told me he was too scared of what they might find if they started digging around that property, and honestly, he didn't want to get involved any deeper than he already was. He put in his 2 weeks' notice with Amazon the following Monday and hasn't done delivery work since. But here's the part that really gets to me about Marcus's story. About 6 months after he quit, he was scrolling through local news online when he came across a missing person report. A woman named Sarah Chen had disappeared from a nearby town, last seen leaving work on a Thursday evening in November. The date matched exactly with Marcus's first delivery attempt to that house. The woman in the photo looked to be in her 30s, with long dark hair and a bright smile. Marcus stared at that photo for a long time, he told me, wondering if that could have been the voice he heard screaming for help that night. He never contacted the police about it, and to this day, Sarah Chen has never been found. Marcus says he still has nightmares about that concrete patch in the backyard and what might be buried underneath it. The second story comes from a driver named Jessica, who worked the overnight shift in a major city on the East Coast. Now Jessica was tough as nails. She'd been doing delivery work for years and had seen pretty much everything you could imagine. Drunk customers, aggressive dogs, sketchy neighborhoods at 3 in the morning. Nothing really fazed her anymore, or so she thought. This particular incident happened on a Saturday night in March, around 11:30. Jessica was making her rounds through a residential area that she knew pretty well, mostly apartment complexes and row houses. The delivery was to a ground-floor apartment in a building she'd been to several times before. Nothing unusual about the address or the package, just a standard Amazon box addressed to someone named David Miller. Jessica parked her van and grabbed the package, noticing that most of the apartments in the building were dark, except for a few scattered windows with lights still on. The building had this long hallway that ran down the center, with apartments on both sides, and the lighting was pretty dim even during the day. She found apartment 4B and knocked on the door. Almost immediately, she heard footsteps approaching from inside, which was normal enough. But then the footsteps stopped right at the door and stayed there. No sound of locks being undone, no voice asking who it was, just silence. Jessica knocked again and called out, "Amazon delivery for David Miller." Still nothing. She could sense someone standing right on the other side of that door, but they weren't responding. This wasn't entirely unusual. Some people were just paranoid about opening doors late at night, especially for strangers. After waiting another minute, Jessica decided to leave the package by the door and take her photo. But as she was crouching down to set the box on the floor, she heard something that made her freeze. It was breathing, heavy and deliberate, coming from right behind the door. Someone was definitely there, standing maybe 2 feet away from her, but they were just listening. That's when she noticed something else. The gap at the bottom of the door, the little space between the door and the threshold, was blocked out. Not by a draft stopper or a towel, but by what looked like someone's feet. 2 feet, positioned right against the door, and they weren't moving. Jessica slowly stood back up, every instinct telling her something was seriously wrong. She'd delivered to plenty of weird customers before, but this felt different. The person behind that door wasn't just being cautious or antisocial. They were actively hiding, listening to her every move. She decided to just leave the package and get out of there. But as she turned to walk back down the hallway, she heard the door creak open behind her. Not all the way, just a crack, maybe an inch or two. Jessica stopped walking but didn't turn around. She could feel someone watching her from that narrow opening in the door. Then she heard a voice, barely above a whisper, saying, "Wait." It was a man's voice, but there was something off about it. It sounded strained, like the person was having trouble speaking, or maybe like they were trying not to wake someone else up. Jessica turned around slowly, and through that crack in the door, she could see part of a face. Just one eye and part of a cheek, but what she saw made her stomach turn. The visible skin was covered in what looked like fresh bruises, dark purple and black marks that suggested recent trauma. And the eye looked terrified. "Are you okay?" Jessica asked, keeping her voice low. The eye in the crack moved, looking left and right down the hallway, as if checking to make sure they were alone. "Help me," the voice whispered, so quietly that Jessica had to strain to hear it. "Please." Jessica immediately pulled out her phone, ready to call the police, but the voice behind the door became urgent. "No, don't. Not here. He'll hear you." "Who will hear me?" Jessica whispered back. But before the person could answer, she heard heavy footsteps coming from somewhere deeper inside the apartment. The eye in the crack went wide with terror, and the door slammed shut. Jessica could hear what sounded like a struggle inside. Furniture scraping, something hitting the wall, and then a sharp cry of pain that was quickly muffled. Jessica didn't hesitate. She ran straight to her van and called the police from there, giving them the address and explaining what she'd witnessed. The dispatcher kept her on the line while officers were dispatched to the scene, and Jessica watched from across the street as 2 patrol cars pulled up about 10 minutes later. The officers went to apartment 4B and knocked on the door. This time it was answered almost immediately by a tall, well-dressed man who seemed completely cooperative and friendly. Jessica watched as they talked for several minutes on the doorstep. The man gestured casually, smiled at the appropriate moments, and appeared to be answering all their questions without any problems. After about 15 minutes, the officers came over to Jessica's van. They told her they'd spoken with David Miller, the resident of the apartment, and everything seemed fine. He'd explained that he'd been dealing with a medical issue, some kind of dental surgery that had left his face swollen and bruised. He'd been taking pain medication that made him groggy and confused, which explained his strange behavior at the door. As for the cry of pain Jessica had heard, Miller had told the officers he'd accidentally knocked over a lamp while trying to navigate his apartment in the dark. The officers had looked around the visible areas of the apartment and hadn't seen anything suspicious. No signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone else was in the apartment, and Miller seemed coherent and uninjured during their conversation. Jessica wasn't satisfied with this explanation. but the officers assured her they'd done a thorough check and everything appeared legitimate. They thanked her for calling it in and said they'd file a report, but there wasn't much else they could do without evidence of an actual crime. But here's what really bothered Jessica about the whole situation. As the police were leaving and she was getting ready to continue her route, she happened to glance up at the apartment building one more time. In the window of apartment 4B, she saw a shadow move across the curtains. Just for a split second, but it looked like two people, not one. And one of those shadows appeared to be much smaller than the man who had answered the door. Jessica finished her shift that night, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd witnessed something terrible and hadn't been able to help. She started paying extra attention to that apartment building on her future routes, always looking for any signs that something might be wrong. About a month later, she noticed that apartment 4B appeared to be vacant. The windows stayed dark night after night, and there was a pile of mail building up outside the door. When she asked the building manager about it, she was told that David Miller had moved out suddenly, leaving no forwarding address and abandoning most of his belongings. Jessica never found out what really happened in that apartment, but she's convinced that the person behind the door that night was in serious trouble. She's haunted by the thought that someone might have needed her help, and she wasn't able to provide it. The third and final story comes from a driver named Ryan who worked the rural routes outside of Denver, Colorado. Ryan had been with Amazon for about 3 years when this incident happened, and unlike Marcus and Jessica, he actually considered himself pretty fearless when it came to weird delivery situations. He'd grown up in the mountains, was comfortable with isolation, and had dealt with everything from aggressive wildlife to suspicious property owners without batting an eye. But what happened to Ryan on that cold February afternoon changed his entire perspective on the job, and ultimately led him to transfer to urban routes where he'd never have to make another rural delivery again. It started out as a completely normal day. Ryan was about halfway through his route, making good time despite the light snow that had been falling since morning. The delivery was to an address he'd never been to before, but that wasn't unusual. New customers signed up for Amazon Prime every day, and the rural areas were always expanding their delivery zones. The GPS led him down a series of increasingly narrow roads until he finally found himself on what was barely more than a dirt track winding through heavy pine forest. The address was for a property at the very end of this road, and as Ryan drove deeper into the woods, he noticed there were no other houses visible anywhere. No mailboxes, no driveways, nothing to indicate that anyone else lived out here. After about 10 minutes of careful driving on the rough terrain, Ryan finally saw a clearing ahead. The house that came into view was unlike anything he'd encountered on his routes before. It was massive, easily 3 stories tall, but it looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The paint was peeling off in long strips. Several windows were boarded up, and the wraparound porch was sagging so badly it looked like it might collapse at any moment. But here's what struck Ryan as odd. Despite the house's dilapidated appearance, there were clear signs that someone was living there. There was a relatively new satellite dish mounted on the roof, fresh tire tracks in the muddy driveway, and smoke coming from one of the chimneys. It was like someone had moved into a condemned building and was just making do with the bare minimum to survive. Ryan parked his van and checked the package. It was addressed to someone named Eleanor Hartwell, and it was surprisingly heavy for its size. The return address showed it was from a medical supply company, which made Ryan wonder if maybe this was an elderly person who couldn't maintain the property properly but needed to live somewhere remote for health reasons. As he approached the front door, Ryan noticed that all the curtains were drawn tight, even though it was the middle of the day. The porch steps creaked ominously under his weight, and several of the boards felt soft and rotted. He had to be careful where he stepped to avoid putting his foot through the decking entirely. Ryan knocked on the front door and immediately heard what sounded like dozens of footsteps inside the house. Not the footsteps of one person coming to answer the door, but multiple people, all moving at once in different directions. It sounded like a whole family scrambling to get somewhere, but the movement seemed frantic and disorganized. After about 30 seconds, the footsteps stopped, and Ryan heard a woman's voice call out from behind the door. "Who is it?" The voice sounded elderly, which matched his theory about Eleanor Hartwell being an older person living alone. "Amazon delivery for Eleanor Hartwell," Ryan called back. There was a long pause, and then he heard what sounded like multiple people whispering urgently to each other. He couldn't make out the words, but there were definitely several voices having some kind of heated discussion. Finally, the elderly woman's voice came back. "Just leave it on the porch, dear. I can't come to the door right now." This was a pretty standard request, so Ryan set the package down by the door and pulled out his phone to take the required delivery photo. But as he was lining up the shot, he noticed something that made him pause. One of the boarded-up windows on the second floor had a small gap between two of the boards, and there was definitely someone looking down at him through that gap. Ryan pretended not to notice and took his photo, but he kept the person in the window in his peripheral vision. Whoever it was stayed there the entire time, watching his every move. And as Ryan was walking back to his van, he realized there were actually multiple faces visible in various windows throughout the house, some peering through gaps in the boards, others barely visible behind drawn curtains. But here's what really unsettled Ryan about the whole situation. Every single face he could see appeared to be staring directly at him with the same expression. Not curiosity or caution, but what looked like genuine fear. These people weren't just watching a delivery driver do his job. They looked terrified of something. As Ryan reached his van and opened the driver's side door, he heard the front door of the house creak open behind him. He turned around and saw the elderly woman he'd spoken to earlier standing in the doorway. She was probably in her 70s, wearing a faded floral dress and leaning heavily on a wooden cane. But what caught Ryan's attention wasn't the woman herself. It was the fact that she kept glancing nervously over her shoulder into the house, as if she was afraid of something or someone behind her. And when she spoke, her voice was shaky and urgent. "You need to leave now," she said, not loudly, but with an intensity that made Ryan stop what he was doing. "Don't come back here. Tell your company not to send anyone else." "Is everything okay, ma'am?" Ryan asked, genuinely concerned. The woman looked like she wanted to say more, but she kept looking back into the house with increasing anxiety. "Please," she whispered, "just go. And don't tell anyone about this place." Before Ryan could respond, the woman quickly stepped back inside and shut the door. He heard multiple locks being turned and what sounded like furniture being pushed against the door from the inside. Ryan stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Everything about this delivery felt wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what was threatening about it. The elderly woman seemed scared, but not of him, of something else. And all those faces in the windows had looked genuinely terrified. As he was getting into his van, Ryan made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of driving straight back down the dirt road the way he'd come, he decided to turn around in the driveway so he'd be facing the right direction. It was a simple precaution, but it meant he had a clear view of the house as he prepared to leave. That's when he saw something that made his blood run cold. The front door had opened again, but this time it wasn't the elderly woman. A man stepped out onto the porch, a big muscular guy wearing camouflage clothing and carrying what looked like a hunting rifle. He wasn't pointing it at Ryan, but he was holding it in a way that made his intentions clear. The man started walking toward Ryan's van with purpose, not hurrying but moving with the confidence of someone who was used to intimidating people. Ryan didn't wait to see what he wanted. He threw the van into gear and hit the accelerator, kicking up mud and gravel as he sped down the dirt road. In his rearview mirror, Ryan could see the man with the rifle standing in the driveway, watching him leave. But what really freaked him out was that there were now several other people visible around the house, at least 4 or 5 adults, all of them armed with various weapons, all of them watching his van disappear into the forest. Ryan drove as fast as he safely could on that rough road, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He'd encountered plenty of rural property owners who were protective of their land, but this felt different. These people hadn't just been warning him off their property. They'd been prepared to use force if necessary. When Ryan finally made it back to paved roads and cell service, he immediately called his supervisor to report the incident. He described the armed individuals, the woman's frightened demeanor, and his recommendation that Amazon stop delivering to that address entirely. His supervisor listened to the whole story and assured Ryan that he'd flagged the address in their system. No other drivers would be sent there, and they'd mark it as a safety concern in their database. Ryan felt better knowing that none of his coworkers would have to experience what he'd just gone through. But the story doesn't end there. About 2 weeks later, Ryan was scrolling through local news on his lunch break when he came across an article that made his stomach drop. Federal authorities had raided a compound in the mountains outside Denver, arresting multiple individuals on charges related to illegal weapons trafficking and conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism. The article included an aerial photo of the raided property, and Ryan immediately recognized it as the house where he'd made that delivery. The same sagging porch, the same boarded-up windows, the same clearing in the forest. According to the report, authorities had been investigating the group for months after receiving tips about suspicious activity in the area. The raid had uncovered a significant weapons cache, evidence of plans to target federal buildings, and multiple individuals who were wanted on various charges in other states. The elderly woman Ryan had encountered, Eleanor Hartwell, turned out to be the mother of one of the group's leaders, and investigators believe she'd been held at the compound against her will. When Ryan read that last detail, everything clicked into place. The fear in the woman's eyes, her urgent warning for him to leave, the way she kept looking over her shoulder. She hadn't been afraid of him at all. She'd been trying to protect him from the dangerous people holding her captive. The faces in the windows that had looked so terrified weren't afraid of a delivery driver. They were afraid of what the armed men might do if they discovered that an outsider had seen too much, had witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Ryan realized that he'd stumbled onto an active domestic terrorism cell, and his presence there had put both him and the captives in serious danger. If he'd stayed any longer, if he'd asked more questions or tried to help, the situation could have turned deadly very quickly. The news article mentioned that several victims had been rescued during the raid, including an elderly woman who had been reported missing by her family over a year earlier. Ryan was pretty sure that woman was Eleanor Hartwell, and he couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if he'd tried to intervene during his delivery. After reading that article, Ryan immediately contacted the FBI field office handling the case. He provided them with details about his delivery experience, including the exact date and time, descriptions of the individuals he'd seen, and any other information that might be helpful to their investigation. The federal agent he spoke with confirmed that Ryan's delivery had actually been part of how they'd initially located the compound. The GPS tracking data from Amazon delivery vehicles had helped them establish patterns of activity at the remote location, which had contributed to building their case against the group. Ryan learned that his decision to leave quickly when confronted by the armed man had been absolutely the right choice. According to the agent, the group had a history of violence against anyone they perceived as a threat to their operations, and there's no telling what might have happened if Ryan had pushed the situation further. The whole experience left Ryan deeply shaken, not just because of the danger he'd unknowingly walked into, but because of the realization of how vulnerable delivery drivers really are. They go to isolated locations, often alone, with no backup and limited communication with the outside world. Most of the time, that's not a problem. But sometimes, like in Ryan's case, they stumble into situations that are far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. Ryan still works for Amazon, but he transferred to urban routes exclusively. He says he'll never make another rural delivery as long as he lives. And honestly, after hearing his story, I can't blame him for that decision. These 3 stories represent just a tiny fraction of the experiences that delivery drivers face every single day. Marcus, Jessica, and Ryan were all lucky in their own ways. They recognized danger when they saw it and trusted their instincts to get out of harmful situations. But their experiences raise serious questions about the safety protocols for delivery workers and whether companies like Amazon are doing enough to protect their employees from these kinds of encounters. So there you have it. 3 stories that showcase the very real dangers that Amazon delivery drivers face every single day. Marcus stumbling into what might have been a crime scene in rural Oregon. Jessica witnessing what could have been domestic violence in that apartment. And Ryan accidentally delivering to an active domestic terrorist cell. These aren't urban legends or creepypastas. These are real experiences from real people who are just trying to do their jobs. What strikes me most about these stories is how quickly normal situations can turn dangerous. A routine delivery to a house in the woods, a standard apartment drop-off, a package for an elderly woman. None of these should have been life-threatening encounters, but that's the reality for thousands of drivers who are out there right now, making deliveries to strangers in unfamiliar places with no backup and limited ways to.